Think about separating out into libraries. So one of the problems you might get is you have a single purpose, you have a large project and it can only be used for that particular use case. The moment you want to start another project, could be for the same company, you're then starting from scratch pretty much with very little reusability from one project to the other.
Code Mortals. So this is a community we've started fairly recently. We're really keen to share our experiences, but one of our main goals is we want to start the conversation. So we like to think we do things best practice, but we don't have all the answers. And we want to share the experience we've had for the last 15 years each, so 30 years combined.
One of the things you can do with the front end, I mean, we're all talking about Angular, so more on the front end, is to think about separating out into libraries. So one of the problems you might get is you have a single purpose, you have a large project and it can only be used for that particular use case. The moment you want to start another project, could be for the same company, you're then starting from scratch pretty much with very little reusability from one project to the other. So that's one of the problems you come across with a big project that hasn't got sort of libraries that you've built as you've been going along that you can reuse. It becomes very monolithic. So you bring a new person into the team perhaps, they join the project, they can't really see what's going on because such a big project, you don't know where to start. I know I've joined projects even sort of, I started this year for example, and you look at the project and you go, wow, this is just spaghetti everywhere. I don't know what's going on. There's no clear sort of paths for anything. And you can spend weeks just getting up to speed on a project. Whereas if you've got a more focused area to say, okay, we're going to start you being responsible for the brand element of the project or for how the services work or something, then it becomes much easier again. So again, if you're looking at microservices, that's a similar kind of pattern there.
So many places are happy to open source maybe a generic part of their project, but it's usually kind of tangled into the code and they can't pull it out. If they did pull it out, it's a lot of work. So they think, oh, you know what, let's just not open source it then. So I'm quite keen for, if you, I don't know, build a branding library or a graphing library, or you have a set of tools or helpers which we're going to go into, like if you're using the Angular terminology, like pipes and all those sorts of things, you can open source those and it can be used in other projects around the company, different departments, or even other companies can then contribute back to it and help improve. So I think this is really important. I'm going to lead with this one in the future when I go into client meetings. I want to say this is why you need to do this.
Perfectly valid point to make, because absolutely, I mean, we've spoken about it quite recently with people saying, well, if you're trying to open source something and you've put everything in one place, you start to get concerned. What's happening? Where do we keep the keys for the project? Where do we do this? Where do we do that? Whereas if you're taking all your different segments, you can distribute the fringe areas out and just keep that kind of core that you're concerned about to yourself. So it may be one way of getting big projects pushed out to the open source world. So that is good. So you're trying to build a new brand or you want to white label your project. So one example, and something we've done ourselves, is you take your project, you brand it up for one couple of years. Let's imagine you're a big corporate company made up of different segments, and each segment has its own brand, but you all want to have that same project available. How do you brand that up for everyone? Now, some people put that into different themes and they'll bake it into the code base, and there's lots of different answers to it. But another option is creating a separate library. And what you can do to make that consistent is you can take the tests for that library and rebuild multiple libraries for the same brand, but adhering to that same test suite. So you know that then that same branded project can work for any project, and your CI can just build that out, distribute it out with the correct brand that you want.
And I think this is important. So when you're on large projects as well, they might have a specific team that does the branding. It might not be full-time, but they'll look after it. So they can move it forward if they need to, but you're still, because you're using NPM to manage that, then you don't have to take those changes in now. You can take them, upgrade them when you're ready, when you need them. So it allows things to work, I guess, asynchronously and move at different paces.
Okay, so we've sort of said it in words, but this is just a very quick way of sort of depicting a little bit of what you might have. So you might have an application, you might have multiple applications. All of them have a set of services that you want to be made available, models, so how you're sort of dictating the different structure of your objects. And then branding as well. So again, as I said, you might have multiple branding projects that could apply to each of those applications, or branding that needs to go across all of them. It just brings in a bit more of a dynamic way of breaking down what you're doing. But that was just a very quick kind of demonstration of what we've talked about just visually to see what we mean by this.
The models one is quite interesting, actually. Sometimes you have the same models across both. Sometimes you have them different for whatever reason. If you're only consuming part of the data, you might have different models in the UI. But a lot of the time, you have the same. and then you just duplicate the code. And whereas if you had the models as a library, then you can share that. There's pros and cons to doing it. So I'm not saying it's a silver bullet to always do it, but sometimes it is needed. It depends on your project, on your stack, and on your business logic. But I find that's quite important, especially when I go to projects and I see that it's just literally copy and paste, and each time they edit something, they just copy and paste the entire folder over. I think there's a better way to manage that.
The main ways in Angular that you build up sort of reusable stuff is components, directives, and pipes. Component, if I very quickly run down, then we talk about components in the form of kind of layout objects. So if you take, we'll show in a minute, material, they have cards, for example, to help manage a layout, to keep consistent on that. Form inputs, so if you want to have a date picker, you can build date pickers in there, or actions, so buttons and so forth. Directives, as I mentioned a minute ago, things like Google Maps, analytics, markdown might sit well as directives. Pipes for kind of taking data and aggregating across it in the template, so currency, doing calculations like totaling up an array, those kinds of things are fairly popular for pipes. But just for those that haven't built a component with Angular before, this is kind of the template of getting something started. You would generally start with the component syntax. So this is Angular saying this is going to be a component, and you provide it with three things. So the first one is this selector, and that's going to be what you use on the HTML. So over here you've got an example of using it. We're going to use that CodeMortals example that matches to this selector to find it on the HTML to say this is what we want to use. And then you have two more. You have a template HTML, so this is the HTML you want to execute. So when I call that CodeMortals example, it's going to actually present it back like this as a button in effect. And this ng content, we'll talk about that in a second. And then the style, how do you want to style it with? So we haven't got an example, but that's really a standard CSS file that can style up this button however we want. So that will tie it all together. And one of the good things with a component is it encapsulates all of that as well. So it doesn't bleed out to the rest of the page. So whatever you name your styles as in here will stay within this world unless you explicitly tell it not to. There's always that option that you can explicitly say, actually, you know what, it can bleed out. And that can have unusual effects. I try to make it as unusual as possible to ever do that, but there are rare occasions where you need to.
The equivalent's like exclamation mark important on your CSS. You never want to use it, but occasionally if you're using a third-party library you don't control, you might have to do it. But yeah, it's something you don't really want to do.
We're not kind of having selectors anymore, and the name will be what you write on the HTML. So again, the example in the HTML on the side here, I've got a sentence, hello world, which is 11 characters long. I want to truncate it to 10, so the D would be lost if I was to run that. And you just run this pipe transform. So you have to implement, so what Eddie was mentioning a minute ago, you've got to implement this. It requires you to have this transform method in here. The signature, you can keep going as long as you want. You can keep adding more and more attributes, but you have to have at least one input value to it. And then some sort of return type. So this one is just literally splicing the text to reduce it down.